I watched my husband's face drain of all color as Vanessa waddled into our anniversary dinner, her 7-month pregnant belly leading the way like some grotesque announcement. "Surprise, honey," she called across the restaurant, her voice carrying that particular sweetness reserved for public humiliations. At 35, with caramel highlights framing a face that looked 10 years younger than mine, she was everything I apparently wasn't anymore. Fertile, exciting, new. I sipped my champagne and observed as James, my husband of 12 years, fumbled with his napkin, his wedding band catching the candlelight as he searched desperately for words. "Katherine, I can explain," he whispered. But really, what explanation could possibly suffice for the pregnant woman now standing beside our table, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, a belly carrying my husband's child? "Dr. Reynolds," the maître d' approached nervously. "Is everything all right? Should I add another place setting?" I placed my napkin beside my barely touched seafood linguine and rose with a calm that surprised even me. "No need. I believe my husband and his guest would prefer to dine alone." The murmurs from nearby tables created a symphony of judgment, as smartphone cameras discreetly captured what would undoubtedly become tomorrow's gossip at Memorial Hospital, where James and I both worked. He as chief of cardiology, me as head of hospital administration. The career I had built over 18 years while supporting his medical education, residency, and rise to departmental leadership. "Katherine, please." James reached for my wrist, panic etching lines around his eyes. "This isn't what it looks like." "It looks like your mistress is carrying your child and decided our 12th anniversary dinner was the appropriate venue for a gender reveal," I replied, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening within me. "Did I miss anything, Vanessa?" She placed a hand dramatically on her chest, feigning innocence. "James said you knew all about us, that you two had an arrangement." Her eyes widened with practiced surprise. "He promised me you were separating months ago." Of course he had. The same lies from the same playbook used by unfaithful spouses since time immemorial. With trembling hands that I refused to acknowledge, I gathered my purse and coat. 12 years of marriage imploding in a single moment, in front of an audience of Portland's finest diners at Magnolia, the restaurant where James had proposed to me on bended knee. The perfect setting for maximum dramatic effect. I had to admire Vanessa's flair for theater, if nothing else. "Katherine," James started again, half rising from his chair. "Don't worry about coming home tonight," I said quietly. "Or any night, for that matter." As I walked out of the restaurant with my spine straight and head high, I felt a curious sensation beneath the shock and humiliation. Not just rage or heartbreak, but something unexpected. Relief. Because for the past 8 months, I had suspected something was wrong. For the past 5 months, I had been gathering evidence. And for the past 3 months, I had been making preparations. James had no idea what was coming next. The drive home from Magnolia felt surreal. Portland's familiar streets blurring through unshed tears I refused to let fall. Rain pelted my windshield, mirroring the storm raging inside me as I pulled into the circular driveway of our West Hills home. The 4,500 square foot Tudor-style house we had purchased 3 years ago when James became department head. I sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the warm glow emanating from windows I had personally selected during the renovation. The perfectly manicured landscaping I maintained despite my 60-hour work weeks. The mailbox with Dr. and Dr. Reynolds engraved on polished brass. 2. Doctors. 1 marriage, 0 children, not for lack of trying. 4 rounds of IVF, 3 miscarriages, and countless nights spent crying in our master bathroom while James slept peacefully, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, with my private grief. The last miscarriage had been 2 years ago, after which we had mutually decided to stop trying. At least, that's what James told our friends and family. In reality, he had simply stopped discussing it, changing the subject whenever I broached the topic of adoption or surrogacy. Now I understood why. I finally entered our home, my heels echoing on the marble foyer tiles. Everything looked exactly as I had left it that morning. James's medical journals stacked neatly on the coffee table, my laptop closed on the kitchen island where I had been reviewing hospital budget proposals before getting ready for our special evening. 12 years. 12 years of partnership I thought we had built. My first decade spent supporting James through medical school and residency, working double shifts as a hospital administrator to pay our bills while he focused on becoming the brilliant cardiologist everyone now admired. The lean years in our first apartment where the heat failed every winter, the careful budgeting for his student loans, the weekends and holidays spent alone while he was on call. I had believed in us, in him, in the life we were creating together. I moved through the house like a ghost, touching surfaces, remembering moments. The dining room table where we'd hosted his department colleagues last Christmas. The living room where we'd sit on Sunday mornings, reading the paper and discussing hospital politics. The kitchen where I'd prepare his favorite meals on the rare evenings neither of us worked late. Upstairs, our bedroom held too many memories to face immediately. So instead, I entered the home, office we shared. My side, meticulously organized with color-coded files and neatly labeled folders. James's side, cluttered with medical reference books and patient notes he brought home despite my repeated warnings about confidentiality breaches. I sat at my desk and opened the bottom drawer where I kept personal documents, our marriage certificate, property deeds, insurance policies. And beneath them, a burgundy folder I had started 8 months ago when James first began working late with suspicious frequency. Inside was everything. Credit card statements showing hotel charges and restaurant bills for 2 on evenings he was supposedly at medical conferences. Phone records highlighting a particular number called dozens of times each week. Screenshots of text messages I had glimpsed accidentally when his phone lit up beside me one night. Messages that had prompted my initial suspicion. There were also bank statements showing unusual withdrawals, $4,000 here, $6,000 there. Money I now suspected had been financing Vanessa's prenatal care at some private practice far from our hospital's gossiping halls. What James didn't know, what he had never bothered to learn despite my repeated attempts to involve him in our financial planning, was that I managed every aspect of our financial life. I paid the bills, balanced the accounts, handled the investments, and maintained our property portfolio. The portfolio that included not just our primary residence, but 3 rental properties, a vacation cabin on Mount Hood, and a substantial investment account, all in both our names, of course. We were partners, after all. The burgundy folder also contained a second, slimmer file, one I had created just 3 months ago when my suspicions had crystallized into certainty. This file contained a different kind of documentation. Consultations with divorce attorneys, property valuations, and detailed notes on Oregon's divorce laws. I hadn't wanted to believe it would come to this. Even with mounting evidence, I had clung to the possibility of some innocent explanation. Perhaps I was paranoid, damaged by the trauma of repeated pregnancy losses. Perhaps he was planning some elaborate surprise. The surprise had certainly been elaborate, I would give him that. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, James's face lighting up my screen. I silenced it without answering and continued reviewing my carefully gathered evidence. 3 more calls came in succession, followed by a flurry of texts. "Katherine, please pick up. It's not what you think. I can explain everything. Where are you? Are you safe?" Safe. The irony of that question wasn't lost on me. Had he been concerned about my safety when he was creating a new life with another woman? When he was systematically destroying the foundations of our marriage? I finally texted back a single line, "Don't come home tonight. I'll have my attorney contact you tomorrow." Then I silenced my phone completely, poured myself a generous glass of the Macallan 18 we had been saving for a special occasion, and began formulating my next steps. Because while James had been busy creating his new family, I had been quietly preparing for a future I had hoped would never arrive. A future without the husband I had loved and supported for 12 years. A future I now faced alone, but not unprepared. Morning arrived with harsh clarity, sunlight streaming through curtains I had forgotten to close. I found myself still in my anniversary dress, curled on the guest bedroom sofa, where I had eventually collapsed after hours of alternating between rage-fueled planning and moments of paralyzing grief. The champagne flute from last night, refilled several times with scotch, lay empty on the carpet beside a stack of financial documents I'd pulled from our home safe. The house phone rang, piercing the silence. We kept a landline mainly for emergencies, and few people had the number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Katherine? Thank God." It was Margaret, James's mother. "James said there was a misunderstanding last night that you weren't answering. Your cell. He's worried sick." Of course he had called his mother. James had always run to Margaret when facing consequences for his actions, ever since I had met him during his first year of medical school. Margaret, who had never quite approved of me despite my unwavering support of her precious son. Margaret, who had frequently commented on my dedication to my career with thinly veiled judgment, suggesting that perhaps if I focused more on home life, we might have been blessed with children by now. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Margaret," I said, my voice hoarse from crying and scotch. "Your son's pregnant girlfriend showed up at our anniversary dinner last night. I believe that's what most people would call getting caught." The silence on the other end was almost satisfying. "That can't be right," she finally said. "There must be some explanation. James did," I interrupted, too exhausted for diplomacy. "Ask him about Vanessa from radiology. Ask him about the baby due in 2 months. Ask him why he's been emptying our joint account for prenatal vitamins and bassinet shopping." Another lengthy pause. "Katherine, please. You're obviously upset, but making accusations won't solve anything. Why don't you come over for lunch? We can talk this through like family." Family. The word sliced through me, opening fresh wounds. The family I had wanted so desperately but couldn't create. The family James was now building with someone else. "I'm not coming to lunch, Margaret, and I suggest you prepare yourself for the reality that your son has destroyed our marriage. Goodbye." I hung up before she could respond, then unplugged the landline entirely. My cell phone showed 27 missed calls and 43 text messages, most from James, several from his parents, and a few from mutual friends already caught in the blast radius of our imploding marriage. The only message I opened was from Linda Chen, my closest friend and the hospital's legal counsel. "Heard what happened. Divorcing a doctor is my specialty. Call me when you're ready." A small laugh escaped me, tangled with a sob. Linda had divorced one of the orthopedic surgeons 3 years ago after catching him with a pharmaceutical rep. She had taken him for everything, including his beloved vintage car collection. I had admired her steely resolve then, never imagining I would need the same strength. The doorbell rang, followed by insistent knocking. I peered through the peephole to see my sister Claire, holding a tray of coffee cups and what appeared to be a bag from our favorite bakery. I opened the door, suddenly aware of my disheveled appearance. Yesterday's makeup smeared across my face, hair tangled, designer dress wrinkled beyond salvation. "Oh, Kat," Claire whispered, taking in my state, with wide eyes. I came as soon as Linda called me. The hospital grapevine was nothing if not efficient. By now, everyone from the janitors to the board of directors probably knew about Dr. Reynolds's pregnant mistress and the anniversary dinner showdown. "I look that bad, huh?" I attempted a smile. That felt more like a grimace. Claire set the coffee and pastries on the entry table and pulled me into a fierce hug. "You look like someone whose world just imploded," which is exactly appropriate. That simple validation broke something in me. The carefully constructed composure I had maintained at the restaurant, the calculated anger that had fueled my late-night planning, all of it crumbled under my sister's understanding embrace. Sobs tore from my chest, painful and raw. "He's having a baby with her," I gasped between heaving breaths. "A baby, Claire. After everything we went through. After holding me through 3 miscarriages and promising it didn't matter, that we were enough for each other." Claire guided me to the living room couch, keeping one arm firmly around my shoulders. "He's a lying, cheating piece of garbage," she stated matter-of-factly, "and he's going to regret this for the rest of his miserable life." I laughed weakly, through my tears. Claire had never been James's biggest fan, even in the early days when I was blinded by love and ambition, both his and mine. "The worst part," I confessed, accepting the tissue she offered, "is that some sick part of me still loves him. 12 years, Claire. 12 years of building a life together. How do you just turn that off overnight?" "You don't," she said gently. "But you can acknowledge that love while still recognizing he doesn't deserve it anymore." She retrieved the coffee and pastries, forcing a maple scone into my hand despite my protests that I couldn't possibly eat. "Fuel for the battle ahead," she insisted. "And trust me, it will be a battle." As the caffeine began to clear the fog of grief and alcohol, my analytical mind slowly re-engaged. Claire was right. This would be a battle, not just legally and financially, but emotionally and professionally. James and I didn't just share a marriage and assets. We shared a workplace, friends, professional connections. Our divorce would have far-reaching implications for both our careers. "I need to shower," I said suddenly, the weight of yesterday's clothes and makeup becoming unbearable. "And then I need to call Linda." Claire nodded approvingly. "That's my girl. I'll be right here when you're done." "And Katherine?" Her expression softened. "It's okay to fall apart. Just do it in the shower where no one can see, then come out swinging." Under the scalding water, I finally allowed myself the privacy to completely break down. I sobbed until my throat ached, until the water ran cold, mourning not just the marriage I had lost, but the future I had planned. The growing old together, the potential children we might have eventually adopted, the retirement dreams we had tentatively sketched out. By the time I emerged, wrapped in my thickest robe with hair dripping onto my shoulders, something had shifted inside me. The grief remained, a heavy stone in my chest, but alongside it grew something else, a cold, clarifying anger. Not the hot, reactive rage of last night, but something more dangerous and focused. James hadn't just betrayed our marriage, vows. He had systematically deceived me while building a parallel life, all while benefiting from everything I contributed to our partnership. He had leveraged my professional support, my financial acumen, my social connections to advance his career, all while planning his exit strategy with Vanessa. "Claire," I called, my voice steadier than it had been all morning. "Hand me my phone. It's time to call Linda." Because while James had been playing doctor with his radiologist Mistress, he had forgotten one crucial detail. I wasn't just his supportive wife. I was Katherine Reynolds, MBA, hospital administrator, the woman who had built her career navigating the treacherous waters of healthcare politics and finance. And I was about to show my husband exactly what that meant. The hospital. Boardroom fell silent as Robert Davidson, CEO of Memorial Hospital, closed the folder I had presented and removed his reading glasses. "Let me make sure I understand correctly, Katherine," he said, his voice measured. "You're requesting temporary reassignment to the outpatient expansion project due to your personal situation?" "That's correct, Robert. Given the circumstances of my impending divorce and the fact that Dr. Reynolds heads one of the departments under my current administrative oversight, I believe it's the most professional approach." It had been 1 week since the restaurant incident, and this meeting represented my first strategic move on the professional chessboard. Across the table sat Robert, Linda Chen as legal counsel, and Diane Michaels, our chief operating officer. I appreciate your proactive handling of this delicate situation, Robert said, selecting his words carefully. The outpatient expansion is a $40 million investment requiring steady leadership. You're certain you can focus on that while managing personal challenges? I met his gaze directly. I've never allowed personal matters to affect my professional performance in 15 years at Memorial, Robert. I don't intend to start now. Diane nodded approvingly. She had been my mentor when I first joined Memorial's administrative team, recognizing my potential before others. Katherine's organizational abilities and financial acumen would be tremendous assets to the expansion project. The board has concerns about the current budget projections. They should, I replied, reaching into my briefcase for another folder. I've taken the liberty of reviewing the current project financials. There are significant inefficiencies in the proposed operational structure. I hadn't planned to present this analysis today, but Robert's subtle questioning of my professional focus had triggered something in me. For years, I had filtered my ambitions and insights, careful not to outshine James in our shared workplace. That limitation no longer applied. Robert raised an eyebrow as he accepted the unexpected document. You prepared this while dealing with your current situation? I work well under pressure, I said simply. And I've actually had concerns about the expansion budget for months, but hadn't found the appropriate opportunity to address them. As Robert and Diane reviewed my analysis, which identified nearly $4.6 million in potential savings through restructured staffing models and modified equipment procurement strategies, I caught Linda's approving glance. This was exactly the approach we had discussed, demonstrating exceptional professional value while creating distance from James's department. This is quite thorough, Robert finally said, impressed despite himself. Some of these inefficiencies weren't caught by the external consultants we paid $500,000 to identify. The consultants don't understand our internal operations the way someone who's worked here for 15 years does, I replied, allowing a hint of confidence to color my voice. I've managed departmental budgets through 3 hospital mergers and 2 reimbursement restructures. I know where the hidden costs accumulate. Diane closed the folder with a decisive motion. I think Katherine's reassignment to the expansion project is clearly in the hospital's best interest, regardless of her personal circumstances. In fact, I'd suggest we consider making her the project executive, not just a contributor. Robert nodded slowly, recalibrating his assessment of the situation and of me. Agreed. Katherine, can you transition your current responsibilities by the end of next week? I've already prepared transition documentation for each department, under my oversight, I replied, retrieving yet another folder from my briefcase, including comprehensive status updates on all ongoing projects and budget reviews. The slight widening of Robert's eyes confirmed what I had intended to demonstrate. I was not just a competent administrator, but an exceptional one who had perhaps been underutilized in my current role. Well, he said after a moment, it seems you've thought of everything. Not everything, I admitted, shifting to the more difficult part of our meeting. There's still the matter of the ethics violation regarding Dr. Reynolds' undisclosed relationship with a staff member under his hierarchical authority. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Hospital ethics violations involving department chiefs were politically sensitive, particularly when the department chief in question was a nationally recognized cardiologist who brought in substantial research funding. I've prepared an initial assessment of potential liability issues, Linda interjected smoothly, sliding a document toward Robert. As legal counsel, I'm obligated to inform leadership of possible exposure. Robert frowned as he scanned the document. This suggests Dr. Reynolds has been directly involved in performance reviews and compensation decisions for Ms. Collins, while maintaining an undisclosed personal relationship. The relationship appears to have been ongoing for at least 7. Months based on the pregnancy timeline, Linda confirmed, during which period Dr. Reynolds approved Ms. Collins's annual performance review, resulting in a grade increase and corresponding pay adjustment. Diane's expression had hardened. As COO, departmental ethics violations ultimately reflected on her leadership. This is exactly the situation our disclosure policy was designed to prevent. To be clear, I added carefully, I'm not pursuing this as a vindictive measure against my husband. My concern is protecting the hospital from potential liability. As an administrator, that remains my professional obligation regardless of personal circumstances. It was the perfect framing, demonstrating institutional loyalty while highlighting James's failure to uphold the same professional standards. The fact that it would complicate his already deteriorating position was merely a secondary benefit. Robert sighed heavily, the political calculations visible in his expression. James Reynolds was a valuable asset to Memorial. His reputation, research contributions, and patient base represented significant value. But ethics violations involving preferential treatment had resulted in costly lawsuits at competing hospitals. I'll need to convene the ethics committee, he finally said. This will require careful handling. Of course, I agreed. I've recused myself from any administrative decisions regarding cardiology during my transition to avoid any appearance of conflict. As the meeting concluded, Robert asked me to remain behind while Linda and Diane departed. Katherine, he said, once we were alone, I've known you and James for many years. I considered you both friends as well as colleagues. I maintained my professional composure, though the reference to friendship stung unexpectedly. Robert and his wife had dined at our home numerous times, celebrated milestones with us, even vacationed together at our Mount Hood property. I appreciate that, Robert. This situation is unfortunate, professionally and personally. He removed his glasses again, a gesture I recognized as his transition to more candid conversation. I won't pretend I understand the details of what's happened in your marriage. That's not my business. But I do need to understand one thing clearly, which is your end game here. He leaned forward slightly. You're one of the sharpest administrators I've ever worked with. Every move you're making, the department transition, the ethics concern, this impressive analysis of the expansion project, it's all strategic. I respect that. But I need to know where this is headed. The question deserved honesty, at least partial honesty. My endgame is ensuring my professional standing remains intact while I navigate a difficult personal transition, I answered carefully. I've invested 15 years in this institution. I won't allow my husband's poor decisions to undermine the career I've built. Robert studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. And the expansion project executive role? Is that part of your endgame as well? A small smile escaped before I could suppress it. Let's say it's an opportunity I'm well positioned to maximize. Always 3 steps ahead, Robert remarked, returning the smile. It's why your departments consistently outperform budget projections. He stood, indicating our conversation was concluding. For what it's worth, Katherine, I think James has catastrophically underestimated you. It's a mistake I've never made with my own wife, and one I suspect he'll regret deeply. As I walked back to my office to begin my departmental transition, I reflected on Robert's assessment. James had indeed underestimated me, but not in the way most people assumed. The gossip circulating through the hospital painted a familiar narrative. Brilliant doctor cheats on career-focused wife who was too busy with work to keep him happy. What no one understood, not even Robert, was that James hadn't just married a career-focused hospital administrator. He had married the daughter of Richard Blackwell, who had built and sold 3 healthcare systems before retiring. I had grown up watching my father navigate the treacherous waters of healthcare politics and finance, learning lessons most MBA programs never taught. My administrative position at Memorial was no accident. When James and I had relocated to Portland for his cardiology fellowship, I had strategically sought employment at the hospital with the strongest cardiac program, knowing it would eventually benefit his career trajectory. When administrative opportunities arose that would give me oversight of resource allocation to clinical departments, I had positioned myself precisely for those roles. For 12 years, I had carefully leveraged my position to advance James's career, ensuring his department received priority consideration for budget allocations, maneuvering to get his research programs highlighted to the board, strategically connecting him with influential physicians and administrators across the healthcare network, all while allowing him to believe his advancement came solely from his clinical brilliance. Now, those same networks, those same strategic capabilities would serve a different purpose. James would soon discover that the professional ecosystem he had navigated so confidently was one I had helped cultivate specifically to support his growth. Support I could redirect or withdraw entirely. My phone vibrated with a text message from an unknown number. "Katherine, it's Vanessa. We need to talk, please." I stared at the message, momentarily thrown by this unexpected contact. What could James's pregnant mistress possibly want to discuss with me? Curiosity won over caution. "About what?" Her response appeared almost immediately. "Things James hasn't told either of us. Please. It's important." I considered the request carefully. Meeting with Vanessa was risky, emotionally volatile, and potentially complicating from a legal standpoint. Linda would advise against it, yet strategic information rarely came from playing it safe. "Tomorrow, 4 p.m. Riverside Park bench near the willow tree. Come alone." As I sent the reply, I wondered what revelations awaited me and how they might alter the careful strategy I had begun to execute. Riverside Park offered neutral territory, public enough to be safe, yet secluded enough for a private conversation. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a bench with clear sightlines in all directions. The willow tree's sweeping branches provided partial privacy, while the nearby playground ensured we wouldn't be completely isolated. A calculated choice for meeting my husband's pregnant mistress. When Vanessa appeared, waddling along the path in maternity leggings and an oversized sweater, she looked markedly different from the confident woman who had interrupted my anniversary dinner. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup, dark circles prominent beneath her eyes. Without the carefully constructed veneer of the other night, she appeared younger, more vulnerable, and utterly exhausted. "Thanka. You for meeting me," she said, lowering herself awkwardly onto the bench, one hand supporting her rounded belly. "You said it was important," I replied neutrally, maintaining professional distance despite the surreal intimacy of sitting beside the woman carrying my husband's child. Something James hasn't told either of us. Vanessa nodded, staring at her interlocked fingers. "I found something yesterday when I was looking for insurance paperwork in James's apartment. Documents I wasn't supposed to see." My interest sharpened, though I kept my expression impassive. "What kind of documents?" "Financial statements, medical records." She finally looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "And divorce papers, already drawn up, dated 3 weeks ago. He's been planning to divorce you even before the restaurant." This wasn't entirely surprising given the financial moves I'd already uncovered, but the formalized legal preparation suggested James was further along in his exit strategy than I had realized. "And this concerns you because," I prompted, watching her carefully. Vanessa's hands trembled slightly as she reached into her shoulder bag, retrieving a folder. "Because according to these papers, he's claiming financial hardship to limit his support obligations to you. But these bank statements show accounts I knew nothing about." She handed me the folder. "Accounts with substantial balances." I opened the folder, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency. What I found sent a cold jolt of shock through me despite my determined composure. account statements from Cayman National Bank showing deposits totaling over $1.7 million, money that had never appeared on our joint financial disclosures or tax returns. The account was opened 4 years ago, predating his relationship with Vanessa but well into our marriage. He told me we were building a life together, Vanessa continued, her voice tight with controlled emotion. That once his divorce was settled, we would be a family. But he's been lying to both of us. Why show me this? I asked, still reviewing the damning financial documentation. You could have kept this information, used it for your own security. She laughed bitterly, protectively cradling her belly. Because I'm not stupid, Katherine. I'm 7 months pregnant, with no family support, involved with a man who's clearly hiding assets and lying to his lawyers. What happens to me and this baby when he decides to move on again? A practical calculation, then. Not conscience or remorse, but self-preservation. I could respect that more than a performative apology. There's more, she added, reaching for the folder and flipping to another section. Medical records, not his patient's, his own. She pointed to a document bearing the letterhead of a urology practice. He had a vasectomy 3 years ago. I stared at the document, the implications cascading through my mind like falling dominoes. 3 years ago, after our third miscarriage, when we had supposedly jointly decided to stop fertility treatments, when James had held me as I cried, assuring me that our childless marriage was enough for him. And yet you're pregnant, I observed, my analytical mind automatically searching for inconsistencies. He told me he had it reversed 6 months before we met, Vanessa explained. But according to his medical records, he never did. I found a separate file. She flipped to another section where showing he's been banking sperm at Northwest Fertility Center since before the vasectomy. The clinical detachment I had maintained began to fracture as the full picture emerged. James hadn't just betrayed our marriage with an affair. He had systematically constructed an elaborate web of deception that extended years into our relationship, making unilateral decisions about our potential for children while pretending to share my grief over our fertility struggles. You're saying the pregnancy was planned, I stated flatly, connecting the final dots. Using his banked sperm, Vanessa nodded, tears finally spilling onto her cheeks. He suggested artificial insemination 3 months into our relationship. Said he wanted to fast-track our future together because he was certain about us. I thought it was romantic. A brilliant doctor so dedicated to building a family with me that he couldn't wait. She wiped her face angrily. Meanwhile, he was telling you that children weren't important to him. The playground across from our bench erupted with the delighted screams of children on the slide, the sound piercing through my carefully constructed professional facade. The children we might have had. The family he had denied wanting with me while secretly planning with someone else. Why did you come to the restaurant that night? I asked, the question that had been gnawing at me since the humiliating public confrontation. Vanessa's expression hardened. Because he told me you knew about us, that you had an arrangement. Then I overheard him on the phone with you, making anniversary plans. I realized he was lying to both of us. She shook her head, disgust evident in her expression. I wanted you to know the truth. It was impulsive and public and probably cruel. For that I am sorry. An unexpected apology, delivered without expectation of forgiveness. I found myself reassessing this woman I had automatically categorized as adversary and homewrecker. She was also James's victim, manipulated through her desires and vulnerabilities, just as I had been, albeit in different ways. What do you want from me, Vanessa? I asked directly. Beyond sharing this information. Honestly? She sighed heavily. I don't know. Protection, maybe. For me and the baby. James controls everything in my life now. My housing, my financial security. Even my job is at his mercy once the ethics committee reviews the violation. And you think I can provide that protection? I think you're smarter than he is, she said simply. And I think you understand what it means to build your life around someone only to discover they've been deceiving you the entire time. She wasn't wrong. Despite the bizarre circumstances, we shared a unique perspective on James that no one else possessed: intimate knowledge of his capacity for calculated deception. I closed the folder, my mind already racing through the legal and financial implications of these revelations. The hidden Cayman accounts were a game changer, potentially constituting financial fraud that would dramatically strengthen my position in divorce proceedings. The vasectomy documentation provided evidence of profound personal betrayal that, while not legally significant, would destroy any sympathy narrative James might attempt to construct. "I'll need copies of these documents," I said after a moment's consideration. "Already made," Vanessa replied, pulling a sealed envelope from her bag. "Everything's here, plus account login information I found in his desk. The originals are back where he keeps them, so he doesn't know I found them." Clever. She had clearly thought this through with the same practical calculation that had brought her to me in the first place. "What happens now?" she asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice. What happened now was that the strategy Linda and I had carefully crafted would need significant revision in light of these revelations. The hidden assets changed everything, legally, financially, and in terms of negotiating leverage. "Now I contact my attorney," I responded, rising from the bench and slipping the envelope into my purse. "And then I'll be in touch about next steps." Why, Vanessa struggled to stand, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. I found myself automatically offering a steadying hand, a reflex of common courtesy that surprised us both. "Katherine," she said hesitantly as I prepared to leave, "I know you have no reason to help me, but whatever you're planning for James, please remember I'm carrying an innocent child who will need support." It was a calculated appeal, certainly, but not an unreasonable one. The child, James's child, was blameless in this sordid situation. "I have no interest in punishing an unborn baby for James's choices," I assured her. "My issue is with him, not his child." As I walked back to my car, clutching the envelope of damning evidence, I felt a strange sense of clarity descending. The pain of betrayal remained, but the fog of confusion had lifted. James wasn't just a cheating husband seeking excitement with a younger woman. He was a calculating manipulator who had orchestrated elaborate deceptions to serve his own interests, while maintaining a carefully crafted public image. The revelation transformed my approach entirely. This wasn't just about protecting what was rightfully mine in our divorce. It was about exposing the true James Reynolds hidden beneath the respected physician facade, not just to me or to Vanessa, but to everyone who had accepted his carefully constructed narrative. I pulled out my phone and texted Linda. "New evidence obtained. Hidden offshore accounts, plus medical documentation of significant deception. Need meeting ASAP." Her response was immediate. "My office, 7 a.m. tomorrow. Bring everything." As I drove home, I contemplated what James might be doing at that moment. Perhaps at the hospital, receiving admiration from colleagues and gratitude from patients, or maybe with his attorneys, plotting strategy based on financial disclosures that were now provably fraudulent. Wherever he was, whatever false narrative he was currently constructing, James had no idea that his pregnant girlfriend had just handed me the key to dismantling not just our marriage, but the entire foundation of his carefully constructed life. The first counter move had been played, and James didn't even know the game had changed. Linda Chen's expression remained impassive as she methodically reviewed the documents spread across her desk, but the slight tightening around her eyes betrayed her professional excitement. Lawyers lived for moments like this, when a seemingly straightforward case suddenly revealed unexpected complexity and opportunity. "This changes our entire approach," she finally said, closing the Cayman account statements. "Undisclosed offshore. Accounts established during marriage constitute financial fraud in divorce proceedings. The court will not look kindly on this level of deception." "What about the medical records?" I asked, gesturing to the vasectomy documentation Vanessa had provided. Less legally relevant, but potentially devastating in settlement negotiations. Linda made rapid notes on her legal pad. Most judges don't care who slept with whom or why, but they care deeply about financial transparency. That said, the vasectomy deception speaks to character and credibility, which matters when James inevitably disputes these offshore accounts. It was day 9 since my anniversary dinner implosion, and the carefully orchestrated strategy Linda and I had initially developed was being rapidly recalibrated in light of Vanessa's revelations. How do we proceed without revealing Vanessa as the source? I asked, mindful of the complicated dynamics at play. She's taking a significant risk, providing these documents. We don't need to specify how we obtained the information, Linda replied. Discovery requests will now include specific demands for all financial accounts, domestic and international. James will either disclose the accounts, committing to his previous deception, or lie under oath, committing perjury. A lose-lose scenario for James. The strategic part of my brain, the part that had managed complex hospital negotiations for 15 years, approved of the elegant trap. The human part still reeled from the magnitude of betrayal these documents represented. I've known this man for 14 years, I said quietly. Married him 12 years ago, believing we were building something meaningful together. How do you reconcile that with someone capable of this level of calculated deception? Linda's expression softened momentarily. You don't reconcile it, Katherine. You accept that the person you married isn't the person you thought they were. Then you protect yourself accordingly. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Memorial Hospital, specifically Robert Davidson's direct line. I need to take this. It's the CEO. Linda nodded, continuing to organize the documents as I stepped into the hallway to answer. Katherine, we have a situation, Robert began without preamble. James is in my office demanding your immediate removal from any oversight of cardiology department matters, past or present. He's alleging biased administrative decisions and threatening legal action against the hospital if we don't comply. Of course he was. James had realized the ethics committee investigation threatened his position and was attempting to undermine my professional credibility in response, his first defensive move in our emerging professional chess match. On what specific grounds? I asked, maintaining my administrator's composure. He claims your oversight of last quarter's budget allocation unfairly restricted cardiology's research funding in favor of oncology, Robert explained, sounding exhausted. He's suggesting it was deliberate sabotage of his department. I almost laughed at the transparent desperation of the accusation. Robert, the budget allocations were approved by the full executive committee after presentation of departmental metrics. Oncology outperformed cardiology on every benchmark last quarter. Patient satisfaction, research publication, grant funding secured. The committee minutes will confirm the decision was unanimous, including James's own vote at the time. A brief silence followed as Robert presumably reviewed the documentation. That appears to be correct, he confirmed. Nevertheless, his allegations create a complicated situation. He's demanding access to all administrative decisions regarding cardiology during your oversight period, which would include the ethics committee investigation documentation regarding his undisclosed relationship with Vanessa, I noted, understanding immediately where this was headed. He's attempting to gain access to the investigation materials. Precisely, Robert sighed. Katherine, I need to know, is there anything in your administrative handling of cardiology that could support his allegations of bias? Anything at all? Considered the question carefully, mentally reviewing 12 years of administrative decisions affecting James's department. I had always been meticulously fair in my professional capacity, perhaps even occasionally disadvantaging cardiology, to avoid any appearance of favoritism toward my husband's domain. Nothing whatsoever, I replied confidently. In fact, An objective review would likely show I held cardiology to higher standards than other departments precisely to avoid accusations of preferential treatment. The documentation will support that consistently. That's what I expected, Robert said, sounding marginally relieved. Nevertheless, given the circumstances, I'm formally recusing you from any involvement with the ethics investigation. Diane will oversee it directly. A reasonable precaution, I acknowledged. Has the committee reached any preliminary findings? They've determined the relationship should have been disclosed under Policy Section 4.7 regarding hierarchical authority. Conflicts, he confirmed. James is arguing that as a technician in radiology, Vanessa wasn't under his direct supervisory authority, but the committee notes he signed off on interdepartmental consult evaluations that directly impacted her performance. Metrics. The technical details of hospital policy violations might seem mundane to outsiders, but in the carefully regulated healthcare environment, such infractions could have significant professional consequences, especially for someone in a leadership position. What's the typical sanction for such a violation? I asked, though I already knew the answer. For department chiefs, removal from leadership position for minimum 6 months, ethics refresher training, and restoration contingent upon board review, Robert recited, quoting the policy verbatim. Katherine, you should know James is suggesting your administrative influence somehow engineered this outcome. The policy predates both our employments at Memorial, I reminded him calmly. And the ethics committee consists of board members and external consultants specifically to prevent administrative influence. As our conversation concluded, I returned to Linda's office with this new development. She listened attentively as I outlined James's professional countermove. He's getting desperate, she observed. Attacking your professional credibility suggests he's anticipating the financial revelations and attempting to establish a narrative of vindictive behavior on your part. It won't work, I replied confidently. My administrative record is impeccable. Nevertheless, we should prepare for escalation, Linda cautioned. Men like James rarely retreat when challenged. They double down. Have you secured your personal financial positions as we discussed? I nodded, having spent the weekend executing the financial protection strategy Linda had outlined. Joint accounts, reduced to minimum required balances, personal accounts established at separate institutions, credit monitoring implemented, safe deposit box secured for important documents. Excellent. And the house? Security codes changed, locks rekeyed, security system upgraded with motion detection and camera monitoring, I confirmed. Claire is staying with me temporarily as a precaution. The house security measures weren't just legal protection for marital assets, they were personal protection against potential volatility. While James had never shown violent tendencies, Linda had seen enough divorce cases to know that previously non-violent spouses sometimes reacted unpredictably when their deceptions were exposed. Good, Linda approved. Now, regarding Vanessa, her information is invaluable, but her position remains precarious. Have you considered my suggestion about potential protection for her as well? I had been weighing this complex aspect of our evolving strategy. Vanessa was simultaneously a key witness to James's deception, the mother of his unborn child, the woman he had chosen over me, and a potential victim of his manipulations. My feelings toward her remained complicated, but my strategic assessment was clear. I've secured a short-term rental apartment in my sister's name, I confirmed. Month-to-month lease, fully furnished, in a secure building with concierge service. If Vanessa chooses to leave James's apartment, it's available immediately. Linda raised an eyebrow, impressed by my thorough preparation. You've thought of everything. Not everything, I admitted. I still don't know how to manage the hospital social dynamics. The gossip is intensifying, and James is actively cultivating sympathy among colleagues. That's why we need to accelerate our timeline, Linda decided, checking her calendar. I'll file the amended divorce complaint tomorrow morning, including allegations of financial fraud and demands for complete disclosure of all domestic and international accounts. Once filed, these become public record. The implications were clear. Once the allegations entered the public record, James's carefully cultivated professional image would begin to crumble. No more controlling the narrative as the brilliant cardiologist whose cold, career-obsessed wife had somehow driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. He'll be served at the hospital, Linda added, a small smile playing at her lips. Unless you'd prefer an alternative location. I considered the options. Having James served with divorce papers alleging financial fraud while at Memorial would certainly be publicly satisfying. A small reciprocation for the humiliation I'd experienced at the restaurant. But it would also complicate my professional standing and potentially generate sympathy for him. Have him served at his attorney's office, I decided. This isn't about public humiliation. It's about justice. Linda nodded approvingly. A wise choice. Speaking of his attorney, Mitchell Hoffman called this morning requesting a settlement conference. Already? I was surprised by the timing. Before discovery has even begun. James likely believes he can charm or intimidate his way to a favorable settlement before the offshore accounts come to light, Linda explained. Hoffman suggested a preliminary discussion of terms to explore amicable resolution opportunities. The legal euphemisms for what would essentially be James attempting to maintain control of the divorce narrative while minimizing his financial exposure. Accept the meeting, I decided after a moment's consideration. But schedule it for after the amended complaint is filed. I want him walking into that settlement discussion knowing exactly what we've discovered. As our strategy session concluded, my phone chimed with another notification, an email from the hospital board secretary. The subject line sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Consideration of interim chief operating officer appointment. I opened it immediately, scanning the content with growing surprise. The board was convening an emergency session to discuss temporary leadership restructuring in light of several developments, including Diane Michaels' unexpected announcement that she would be taking early retirement effective next month, and my name had been put forward as her interim replacement. The professional implications were staggering. The COO position represented a significant advancement, higher compensation, greater authority, and a direct reporting line to the board rather than through intermediary leadership. It was a position I had assumed might be possible in 5 to 7 years, not immediately. More significantly, it would place me permanently outside James's professional sphere of influence while dramatically elevating my institutional authority. As COO, I would outrank all clinical department heads, including the chief of cardiology. The email didn't specify who had nominated me, but I suspected Diane herself, who had been mentoring me with increasing intentionality over the past year. The timing couldn't be coincidental. She was creating an elegantly structured protection of my professional standing just as the divorce proceedings threatened to become messy. I forwarded the email to Linda with a brief note. Professional developments accelerating in unexpected directions. Discuss implications for our strategy? Her reply came seconds later. Accept nomination immediately. Professional advancement during divorce proceedings establishes narrative of value and competence, independent of marriage. Excellent development. As I composed my formal response to the board secretary, accepting the nomination with appropriate professional gratitude, I reflected on the cascading effects emanating from that anniversary dinner confrontation. In just 9 days, the careful equilibrium of my life had been shattered and was reforming into something entirely new, personally painful, but professionally promising. James had underestimated me in our marriage. He was now underestimating me in our divorce. And soon, he would discover the consequences of that miscalculation rippling through every aspect of the life he had taken for granted. The conference room at First Portland National Bank exuded old money confidence with its mahogany, Paneling, leather chairs, and discreet art that likely cost more than most people's homes. I arrived 15 minutes early, as was my habit for significant meetings, with Linda and our financial forensic consultant flanking me like well-dressed sentinels. Everything is prepared, Linda confirmed, setting up her materials at our end of the long table. The amended complaint was filed this morning. James would have been served approximately 2 hours ago at his attorney's office. I nodded, reviewing my own notes one final time. This settlement conference wasn't about resolution. Both Linda and I knew that no agreement would be reached today. This meeting was about establishing dominance in the negotiation, about watching James's face when he realized exactly what we had uncovered. Mitchell Hoffman has a reputation for aggressive posturing in initial settlement discussions, Linda continued, arranging documents in precise order. He'll likely open with minimizing James's financial obligations while emphasizing your strong earning potential. Standard tactics. Let him posture, I replied calmly. We have the offshore account documentation. At precisely 2 p.m., the conference room door opened. Mitchell Hoffman entered first, silver-haired, impeccably suited, with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding seven-figure settlements for his high-profile clients. Behind him came James, looking markedly different from the confident cardiologist I had lived with for 12 years. His usual meticulous appearance had slipped, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, dark circles prominent beneath his eyes. The amended complaint had clearly had its intended effect. Our eyes met briefly as he took his seat across the table, and I caught a flicker of something unfamiliar in his expression. Not anger or defiance, but something closer to uncertainty. Katherine, he acknowledged tersely. James, I replied with professional courtesy, noting how strange it felt to address my husband of 12 years with the same detached tone I would use with any hospital colleague. Mitchell Hoffman began with practiced smoothness. While these proceedings are unfortunate, we appreciate the opportunity to discuss potential settlement terms before positions become unnecessarily entrenched. Dr. Reynolds is committed to resolving this situation equitably and expeditiously. Linda's smile contained no warmth. We're certainly interested in equitable resolution, Mr. Hoffman, though given the information contained in our amended complaint, I believe your definition of equitable may require significant adjustment. Hoffman's expression remained unperturbed, though a slight tightening around his eyes suggested he had indeed reviewed the amended complaint with its allegations of financial fraud. These offshore account allegations are speculative at best, he countered smoothly. My client maintains complete transparency in financial disclosures. Any accounts not previously disclosed were established prior to marriage with inherited funds, making them separate property under Oregon law. Our financial forensic consultant, Eleanor Winters, spoke for the first time. That would be a difficult position to maintain given the electronic transfer records, establishing the accounts were funded directly from joint marital assets between 2017 and 2022. She slid a folder across the table. The specific transfers are highlighted, corresponding with withdrawals from the joint Meridian bank account on matching dates. James's face visibly paled as Hoffman reviewed the documentation. This was the moment I had anticipated, watching the carefully constructed deception crumble under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Additionally, Linda continued, we have documentation regarding the vasectomy procedure performed in 2019, which Dr. Reynolds concealed from his wife while they continued pursuing fertility treatments for another 7 months, incurring significant medical expenses and emotional distress. The deliberate cruelty of that particular deception still had the power to knock the breath from my lungs, despite the days I'd had to process it. James had held my hand through 3 more painful, expensive fertility treatment cycles after secretly ensuring they could never succeed. James finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. Where did you get this information? These are private medical records. Accessing them without authorization is illegal. It was the defensive reaction, of someone who knew the documentation was authentic, but was desperate to invalidate it on procedural grounds. The method of discovery is irrelevant to their admissibility, Linda replied calmly. But rest assured, all documentation was legally obtained. More importantly, do you dispute their accuracy? James glanced at his attorney, who gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head, a warning not to answer the question directly. My client's medical decisions are not relevant to equitable division of marital assets, Hoffman interjected smoothly. Whatever personal matters existed between Dr. Reynolds and his wife have no bearing on the financial settlement under Oregon's no-fault divorce statutes. Perhaps, Linda acknowledged, but financial fraud certainly does, as does the deliberate concealment of assets during divorce proceedings. Hoffman leaned forward slightly. These are serious allegations that my client categorically denies. If you persist with these claims, we will be forced to take a much more aggressive posture regarding Katherine's own professional conduct. The implied threat hung in the air for a moment before I responded directly, ignoring Linda's cautioning glance. Are you referring to James's failed attempt to allege administrative bias in cardiology department oversight? I asked, my voice perfectly steady. The hospital board dismissed those claims yesterday after review of voting records confirmed all budgetary decisions were unanimous, including James's own votes at the time. James shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaware his professional counterattack had already been neutralized. Furthermore, I continued, maintaining direct eye contact with my husband, the Ethics Committee has completed its preliminary investigation into James's undisclosed relationship with Vanessa Collins. The findings were submitted to the board this morning, confirming multiple violations of hospital policy regarding hierarchical authority and disclosure requirements. This was news to James. His eyes widened fractionally before narrowing with renewed anger. You engineered that investigation, he accused, professional composure finally cracking. You're using your administrative influence to punish me professionally for a personal matter. The ethics investigation was automatically triggered by HR when your relationship became public knowledge, I corrected him calmly. Standard hospital. Protocol for undisclosed relationships involving department leadership. And as you're well aware, I recused myself completely from the process. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. But I didn't come here to discuss hospital politics, James. I came to discuss your systematic financial deception during our marriage, including hidden accounts containing over $1.7 million in marital assets you attempted to conceal. Hoffman placed a restraining hand on James's arm as he began to respond, then addressed Linda directly. Perhaps we should focus on establishing parameters for a potential settlement framework, rather than exchanging accusations, Linda smiled thinly. Certainly, given the evidence of financial fraud, our settlement framework now includes the following terms: full restoration of all concealed marital assets, punitive division of remaining assets at a 75-25 ratio in our client's favor, and complete financial transparency verified by independent forensic accounting. These terms are absurdly punitive, Hoffman objected immediately. No court would approve such a lopsided division. Courts take a particularly dim view of deliberate financial fraud during divorce proceedings, Linda countered, especially when the concealed assets represent nearly half of the total marital estate. Judge Winters has previously awarded 80-20 divisions in similar cases involving high-earning professionals who attempted to hide assets offshore. It was a masterful name drop. Judge Winters was known for her uncompromising stance on financial transparency in divorce cases. James and his attorney exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the precariousness of their position. Additionally, I added, maintaining direct eye contact with James, I want the Mount Hood property and full ownership of the Portland residence. The vacation property was James's particular pride, a 3-bedroom cabin overlooking the mountain that he used for ski weekends and entertaining colleagues. He had always considered it primarily his, despite it being purchased with joint funds. That's completely unreasonable, James objected immediately, emotions finally overriding his attorney's cautioning presence. The Mount Hood property was purchased with my family's, with funds from our joint account, I interrupted calmly. The same account you later used to establish your Cayman Island holdings. The property records show both our names, and the maintenance has been paid from our shared household budget for 7 years. James's jaw tightened, a familiar sign of suppressed anger I had seen countless times during our marriage. This is vindictive, Katherine. This isn't about fair division. You're trying to take everything that matters to me. Interesting perspective, I replied, allowing a hint of genuine emotion to color my voice for the first time. Did you consider it vindictive when you concealed a vasectomy while watching me undergo 3 more rounds of fertility treatments? Or when you hid $1.7 million in marital assets while planning your exit? Or when you impregnated your girlfriend with banked sperm while telling me children weren't in our future? The conference room fell silent as the questions hung in the air between us. Even Mitchell Hoffman seemed momentarily at a loss for an appropriate legal deflection. James finally broke the silence, his voice low and tightly controlled. I never meant to hurt you, Katherine. It was such a staggering misrepresentation of years of calculated deception that I almost laughed. Intention is irrelevant, James. Impact is what matters. And the impact of your choices has consequences, personally, professionally, and now financially. I gathered my notes and stood, signaling to Linda that I had said what I came to say. Your settlement offer is due within 7 days. If it doesn't reflect full acknowledgement of the concealed assets and appropriate compensation for the financial fraud, we proceed to full discovery and court proceedings. As I walked toward the door, James called after me. Katherine, wait. We should discuss this privately, without the attorneys present. 12 years of marriage deserves at least that much. I turned back slowly, studying the man I had devoted 12 years to supporting, nurturing, and building a life alongside. The man who had systematically betrayed every aspect of our partnership while maintaining a perfect facade of devotion. 12 years of marriage deserved honesty, respect, and transparency, James, I replied quietly. You provided none of those. We have nothing left to discuss privately. As the door closed behind me, I heard Mitchell Hoffman's voice rise in what sounded like pointed questioning of his client. The first cracks in James's legal defense were appearing, precisely as Linda had predicted. In the elevator descending to the lobby, Linda squeezed my arm gently. You were magnificent in there, controlled, precise, devastating. I didn't feel magnificent, I admitted, the professional mask slipping slightly now that we were alone. I felt hollow. That's normal, she assured me. Confronting betrayal of this magnitude is never satisfying in the way people expect. But you've established the parameters for everything that follows. James now understands exactly what he's facing. As we exited the building into the bright Portland afternoon, my phone chimed with a calendar notification. Hospital board meeting, interim COO appointment discussion, 4:30 p.m. The dual tracks of my life continued in parallel, personal devastation alongside professional advancement. In less than 2 hours, I would sit before the hospital board as they considered elevating me to the second highest administrative position in the organization, even as my marriage dissolved in a toxic swirl of deception and betrayal. Are you going directly to the board meeting? Linda asked, noting my attention to the notification. I nodded, already mentally shifting gears from wounded wife to ambitious healthcare executive. The professional advancement couldn't come at a more strategic time. If approved, the COO position places me firmly beyond James's sphere of influence while significantly increasing my compensation and authority. Linda smiled approvingly. Perfect counter-narrative to any claims that the divorce leaves you financially or professionally vulnerable. She checked her watch. I'll call tomorrow after Hoffman's office makes their inevitable request for private settlement discussions. James will be desperate to avoid public proceedings now that we've demonstrated knowledge of the offshore accounts. As my car arrived from the valet service, I found myself reflecting on the direct confrontation that had just occurred. For months, perhaps years, I had been interacting with a version of James that existed only in my perception. The brilliant, devoted husband who shared my values and vision for our life together. Today, I had finally confronted the real James Reynolds, a man capable of breathtaking deception and calculated cruelty. A man who had maintained an elaborate facade throughout our marriage while systematically pursuing his own hidden agenda. The James the Fern had loved had never really existed. That realization, more than any financial deception or infidelity, was what I had truly confronted across that conference room table. And having faced that truth directly, I was finally free to build a future without the shadow of his deception distorting my reality. The Memorial Hospital boardroom fell silent as I concluded my presentation on the outpatient expansion project. 2 weeks had passed since my confrontation with James at the settlement conference, 2 weeks of meticulous preparation for this moment, my formal interview for the interim chief operating officer position. "Thank you, Dr. Reynolds," Robert Davidson said from the head of the table. "Your analysis of the operational inefficiencies in the current expansion plan is quite thorough." The 12 board members exchanged glances, their expressions carefully neutral as they assessed my presentation. Among them sat some of Portland's most influential citizens, corporate executives, philanthropists, and distinguished physicians who govern Memorial's strategic direction. "If I may," interjected Dr. Harold Pierce, chief of surgery and a longtime ally of James's. "While the financial analysis is impressive, I'm concerned about timing. Dr. Reynolds is in the midst of significant personal upheaval. Is this the appropriate moment for such a demanding leadership transition?" The question was delicately phrased, but its implication clear. My divorce made me professionally vulnerable, emotionally unstable, potentially unfit for advancement. Exactly the narrative James had been cultivating among his hospital allies. Met Pierce's gaze directly. "Personal challenges test our professional capacities, Dr. Pierce. During the past 3 weeks, I've continued to fulfill all administrative responsibilities, implemented the transition plan for my current duties, and developed the comprehensive expansion analysis you just reviewed. My performance metrics remain consistent with pre-divorce standards, as the quarterly dashboards in your packets confirm." Diane Michaels, the outgoing COO, nodded approvingly. Katherine's ability to compartmentalize and maintain professional excellence despite personal circumstances is precisely why I recommended her as my interim replacement. Elizabeth Winters, the board chairwoman who had built 3 successful healthcare startups before joining Memorial's leadership, studied me with shrewd assessment. "The outpatient expansion represents a $40 million investment with significant operational risks. Your analysis identifies nearly $6 million in potential savings through restructured implementation. Walk us through your first 90 days if appointed interim COO." For the next 20 minutes, I outlined a detailed action plan, staffing optimizations, vendor renegotiations, technological integration strategies, all anchored in measurable outcomes and clear accountability metrics. It was the kind of focused, data-driven approach I had applied throughout my administrative career, now elevated to system-wide scale. "Impressive," Elizabeth acknowledged as I concluded. "And how would you address the current tension within the cardiology department, given your personal connection to Dr. Reynolds?" The question I had prepared for most extensively, the inevitable exploration of the professional-personal boundary every female executive faces eventually, but with the additional complication of ongoing divorce proceedings. My administrative relationship with cardiology would be governed by the same principles I've applied throughout my career: data-driven decision-making, transparent resource allocation based on outcome metrics, and appropriate delegation when direct oversight could create perceived conflicts, I replied. Additionally, I've already established a recusal protocol for any decisions specifically involving Dr. Reynolds, with oversight transferred to the chief medical officer in those limited instances. Elizabeth nodded, seemingly satisfied. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. The board will deliberate privately now. As I gathered my materials to exit, Robert Davidson's assistant entered the boardroom with evident urgency, whispering something in the CEO's ear. Davidson's expression darkened noticeably before he turned to address the board. I apologize for the interruption, but I've just been informed of a situation requiring immediate attention. The FBI has arrived at the hospital with a warrant regarding financial improprieties involving our cardiac research programs. The room erupted in murmured concern. Memorial's Cardiac Research Division, under James's leadership, had received significant federal grants and pharmaceutical industry funding, millions of dollars flowing through complex research accounting systems. This appears to involve potential misallocation of research funds, Davidson continued, his voice tight with controlled alarm. Specifically, federal grant money designated for clinical trials allegedly diverted to other purposes. My mind raced through implications even as I maintained an outwardly calm demeanor. The cardiac research funding fell under James's direct authority as department chief, with minimal administrative oversight due to the specialized nature of research accounting. Davidson turned to me abruptly. Dr. Reynolds, given your administrative expertise and familiarity with hospital financial systems, would you join me in meeting with the investigators? Your perspective could be valuable in understanding the technical aspects of their inquiries. Every board member's attention shifted to me, watching for my reaction to this dramatic development involving my estranged husband's department. Of course, I replied without hesitation. I'll assist however I can. As we exited the boardroom, Davidson pulled me aside in the hallway. Katherine, I need to know. Did you have any knowledge or suspicion of financial irregularities in the cardiac research division? Absolutely not, I answered truthfully. Research accounting was handled directly by James and his administrative team. My oversight focused on clinical operations budgets, not research fund allocation. Davidson studied my face carefully before nodding. The agents specifically requested your presence when they learned you were on site. They indicated your administrative documentation might be relevant to their investigation. My administrative documentation? The statement made little sense until we reached the conference room where 3 FBI agents waited, credentials displayed. The lead investigator, a woman in her 50s with the sharp, assessing gaze of someone who had spent decades tracking financial crimes, stepped forward. Dr. Katherine Reynolds? I'm Special Agent Diana Mercer. Thank you for joining us. She gestured to the conference table where several file folders lay open. We're investigating financial irregularities involving the Cardiac Research Division, specifically the potential misappropriation of federal grant funds designated for the cardiomyopathy prevention trial. The cardiomyopathy prevention trial, James's pride and joy, a 5-year research initiative that had secured $4.7 million in NIH funding and established his national reputation in preventative cardiology. He had spent countless evenings working on grant applications and research protocols, often missing dinner or arriving home well after midnight during the project's development phase. We understand you had no direct oversight of research accounting, Agent Mercer continued, but our investigation has uncovered a pattern of fund transfers that appears to intersect with some documentation you submitted to the hospital ethics committee 3 weeks ago. Understanding dawned with startling clarity. The Ethics Committee documentation concerned a potential conflict of interest involving Dr. Reynolds' relationship with a staff member. I explained carefully. It didn't address research funding. Not directly, Agent Mercer agreed. But your documentation included performance review records showing Ms. Collins received exceptional evaluations and corresponding compensation increases despite having minimal qualifications for her position. Our investigation suggests her salary was being supplemented through misallocated research funds, potentially to conceal the relationship from you and hospital administration. The implications were staggering. James hadn't just hidden our marital assets in offshore accounts. He had potentially committed federal grant fraud to financially support his relationship with Vanessa. We've traced approximately $217,000 in research funds diverted through miscategorized equipment purchases and consultant fees that appear to have been redirected to personal expenses. Another agent added, pushing several financial spreadsheets across the table, including payments for a private obstetrics practice not covered by hospital insurance and a down payment on a condominium purchased 3 months ago. The condo where James had moved after our separation. The property he had claimed was a rental when financial disclosures were submitted during initial divorce proceedings. The private obstetrics practice where Vanessa had received prenatal care outside the memorial system, presumably to maintain secrecy. We have a warrant to access all cardiac research financial records, Agent Mercer continued, but we hoped you might provide context for some specific transactions identified as potentially irregular. For the next 2 hours, I reviewed transaction records, staffing allocations, and equipment procurement documentation. With my administrator's eye for financial systems, patterns emerged that would have been nearly invisible to those less familiar with healthcare accounting practices. Research coordinator positions created with inflated salaries but minimal. Responsibilities, equipment purchases from vendors without competitive bidding, consultation fees for services insufficiently documented. This consultancy firm, I noted, pointing to a recurring payment recipient, doesn't appear in our approved vendor database. Research departments are required to use pre-approved vendors for all expenditures over $10,000. Interesting, Agent Mercer remarked, making notes. This particular entity received over $180,000 in consulting fees over the past 18 months. Would Dr. Reynolds have authority to approve a vendor outside the normal process? Technically, yes, with appropriate justification documentation, filed with the Research Compliance Office, I explained. But such exceptions are rare and heavily scrutinized due to federal grant requirements. As the review continued, Robert Davidson's expression grew increasingly grave. The potential implications for Memorial extended beyond James's individual actions. Federal grant fraud could jeopardize the hospital's research accreditation, future funding eligibility, and public reputation. Dr. Reynolds, Agent Mercer said as our meeting concluded, your assistance has been invaluable in contextualizing these financial patterns. We may need additional consultation as our investigation proceeds. After the agents departed with copies of the relevant documentation, Davidson turned to me with an expression of mingled shock and calculation. Katherine, I need your absolute discretion regarding this matter until we understand the full scope of the situation. Of course, I agreed. Immediately. The potential reputational damage to Memorial requires careful management. Not just to Memorial, he replied grimly. If these allegations are substantiated, James faces potential federal charges for grant fraud. This goes beyond professional ethics violations or marital deception. We're talking about criminal liability, the YO. Full weight of the revelation settled over me. James hadn't just betrayed our marriage, he had potentially compromised his entire professional future, the hospital's reputation, and the integrity of research that impacted patient care. The magnitude of deception extended far beyond what even I had imagined. The board is still deliberating your appointment, Davidson said after a moment. But I'll inform them of your assistance with the federal investigation. Your administrative expertise clearly proved valuable in identifying potential irregularities. As he walked away, my phone vibrated with a text message from Linda Chen. Mitchell Hoffman called. James requesting urgent private meeting with you tomorrow. No attorneys. Present. Advising strongly against acceptance. I stared at the message, understanding immediately why James was suddenly desperate for a private conversation. He must have been informed of the FBI's arrival at Memorial and realized the investigation threatened not just his career, but potentially his freedom. What James didn't know, couldn't know, was that I had just spent 2 hours helping federal investigators understand exactly how the financial irregularities in his department might constitute criminal fraud. The full scope of his deception was unraveling more dramatically than even I had anticipated. For a moment, standing alone in the empty hospital corridor, I felt a complex wave of emotions. Vindication that James's deceptions were being exposed, shock at the potential criminal dimension, and a strange, unexpected grief for the respected physician and researcher he had once been. I texted Linda back. Agree private meeting inadvisable. Schedule formal settlement conference instead. Full attorney presence required. Whatever James hoped to achieve through private pleading was irrelevant now. The full revelation of his deception had moved beyond the personal realm of our divorce into potential criminal proceedings. A scenario even I hadn't foreseen when this journey began with Vanessa's dramatic entrance at our anniversary dinner. The confrontation had evolved far beyond a betrayed wife seeking justice. Whatever came next would unfold in a much larger arena, with consequences James clearly hadn't calculated when constructing his elaborate web of lies. The second settlement conference took place at Linda Chen's office, rather than the neutral territory of the bank. The power dynamics had shifted dramatically in the 3 days since the FBI investigation began, and the location choice deliberately emphasized that shift. I arrived to find Linda and our financial consultant already reviewing documentation. At the conference table, preparation for what promised to be a pivotal negotiation. Mitchell Hoffman called twice this morning, Linda informed me as I set down my briefcase. He's pushing hard for a comprehensive settlement agreement before the FBI investigation proceeds further. Their new proposal arrived an hour ago. She slid a document across the table, a completely revised settlement offer that bore little resemblance to the position James had maintained just days earlier, where he had previously insisted on keeping the Mount Hood property and substantial, liquid assets. The new proposal conceded nearly everything we had demanded. Full disclosure of offshore accounts, 70-30 asset division in my favor, both properties transferred to my sole ownership, and comprehensive financial transparency verified by independent forensic accounting. This is a surrender, not a negotiation, I observed, scanning the surprisingly generous terms. Exactly, Linda agreed. James is desperate to resolve the divorce quickly and quietly now that he's facing potential criminal charges. The question is whether this settlement adequately compensates for his financial fraud during the marriage. I considered the document thoughtfully. The terms exceeded what most wronged spouses could expect, even in cases of significant deception. From a purely financial standpoint, accepting would secure my future comprehensively while avoiding prolonged legal proceedings. What's your assessment? I asked, valuing Linda's experienced perspective. Financially, it's an excellent outcome, she acknowledged. Better than we might achieve even through successful litigation. But it comes with an implicit expectation of discretion regarding the research funding irregularities. The unspoken arrangement was clear. James hoped resolving our divorce generously might discourage me from actively assisting the federal investigation into his professional misconduct. It was a calculated offer, not a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Is there anything preventing me from accepting this settlement while continuing to cooperate with federal investigators? I asked, thinking through the legal implications. Nothing whatsoever, Linda confirmed. The settlement agreement concerns only marital dissolution and asset division. It cannot legally restrict your cooperation with law enforcement. A knock at the conference room door interrupted our discussion. Linda's assistant announced the arrival of James and his attorney, both looking significantly more stressed than at our previous meeting. Mitchell Hoffman's usual polished confidence had acquired a brittle edge, while James appeared to have aged years and days, his complexion ashen, dark circles prominent beneath haunted eyes. Katherine, James acknowledged my presence with visible discomfort, avoiding direct eye contact as he took his seat across the table. Linda began without preamble. We've reviewed your revised settlement proposal. My client appreciates the more Realistic approach to asset division, particularly the full disclosure of previously concealed accounts. Hoffman nodded stiffly. My client is committed to an expeditious and equitable resolution. The revised terms reflect that commitment. They reflect awareness of legally indefensible position. The financial consultant muttered just loudly enough to be heard, earning a sharp look from Hoffman. Before we proceed, Linda continued smoothly, we require verification of complete financial disclosure. The offshore accounts documented in our previous meeting may not represent the full extent of concealed assets. James tensed visibly while Hoffman attempted to maintain professional composure. The settlement includes provisions for independent forensic accounting precisely to address such concerns. We're proposing comprehensive transparency. Convenient timing, I remarked, speaking directly to James for the first time. This newfound commitment to transparency coincides precisely with federal investigation into your research funding practices. James flinched as though physically struck. Katherine, I know how this appears. It appears that you're offering generous divorce terms hoping to discourage my cooperation with federal investigators, I interrupted calmly. An effort to contain damage that has already escaped your control. Hoffman intervened quickly. The settlement terms stand on their own merits, regardless of other circumstances. We're here to resolve marital dissolution, not discuss unrelated professional matters. Unrelated? I raised an eyebrow. The same pattern of financial deception extends through both situations, hiding marital assets in offshore accounts while simultaneously misappropriating research funds. The behavior seems remarkably consistent. Across the table, James appeared increasingly desperate, his carefully constructed professional facade crumbling visibly. Katherine, please. Whatever you think of me personally, the research program helps people. Real patients benefit from the work we're doing. It was the first glimpse of the physician I had once admired, the man who, despite his personal failings, genuinely cared about advancing medical knowledge to improve patient outcomes. For a moment, I saw the complexity beneath the betrayal, the brilliant, dedicated cardiologist coexisting with the manipulative, deceptive husband. The research program will survive independent of your leadership, I replied, more gently than I had intended. Memorial has contingency plans for departmental transitions. Patient care remains the priority regardless of personnel changes. Hoffman cleared his throat, attempting to redirect the conversation. Perhaps we could focus on the settlement terms specifically. Are there modifications you're requesting to the proposed agreement? Linda took over, detailing several technical adjustments to tax liability provisions and enforcement mechanisms within the settlement structure. As the attorneys engaged in procedural negotiations, James continued watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Something beyond the fear and desperation that had dominated his demeanor since entering the room. When the attorneys stepped out briefly to confer about specific language modifications, James finally spoke directly. I never intended things to unfold this way, he said quietly. The research funding, it started small, reclassifying expenses to cover costs. The grant wouldn't approve directly. Standard practice in most research departments. Bend the rules. A little to get important work done. I maintained my composure, neither accepting nor challenging his rationalization. Then Vanessa happened, he continued. I couldn't have her treatment at Memorial without raising questions. The private practice was expensive, uncovered by insurance. One financial adjustment led to another, each one seemingly justified in the moment. The slippery slope of ethical compromise, I observed neutrally. Small decisions accumulating into significant betrayal. He nodded miserably. By the time I realized how far things had gone, disentangling seemed impossible. The offshore accounts were meant to secure something for our future initially, before you decided your future included Vanessa rather than me, I completed his thought. That decision was yours to make, James. The deception surrounding it was the betrayal, not the choice itself. A complex emotion flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, that in different circumstances, with different choices, our marriage might have ended with dignity intact, rather than this catastrophic implosion of trust and respect. "What happens after the settlement?" he asked, genuine uncertainty coloring his voice. "With the FBI investigation, I mean." "That depends entirely on what their investigation uncovers," I replied truthfully. "My cooperation will be determined by legal obligations, not personal vindictiveness." "They've already suspended my clinical privileges," he revealed, a tremor entering his voice. "Pending investigation outcome. 12 years building that department, Katherine. My entire professional identity." The naked vulnerability in his admission caught me off guard. Despite everything, some remnant of compassion stirred within me. Not for the husband who had betrayed me, but for the physician watching his life's work potentially crumble under scrutiny. "The cardiac program is bigger than one person," I reminded him gently. "The research continues. Patients receive care, medical, knowledge advances. That was always the purpose, wasn't it? Not personal acclaim, but improved patient outcomes?" Before he could respond, the attorneys returned with revised settlement language. The remaining negotiation proceeded efficiently, with James accepting every modification Linda proposed without resistance. By late afternoon, we had a comprehensive agreement ready for final review and signatures. "We'll need court approval, but given the mutually agreed terms, that should be straightforward," Linda explained as the documents were organized for signing. Barring unforeseen complications, the divorce could be finalized within 30 days. 30 days to legally end 12 years of marriage. The administrative efficiency seemed simultaneously appropriate and strangely inadequate for the emotional complexity involved. As James prepared to leave, he hesitated, turning back toward me with evident effort. "There's one thing that wasn't included in the settlement discussions: Vanessa's situation after the baby arrives. With my professional future uncertain, I may not be able to provide adequately." It was the first time he had directly acknowledged potential limitations in supporting his unborn child, a humbling admission from someone who had always projected absolute self-sufficiency. "The child is innocent in all this," I replied after a moment's consideration. "Whatever happens professionally, or legally, that remains true." Relief flickered briefly across his exhausted features. "Thank you for that, at least." After James and his attorney departed, Linda turned to me with professional satisfaction. "This settlement exceeds our most optimistic projections. Financially speaking, you've secured an exceptional outcome." She was right, of course. The agreement guaranteed my financial security regardless of how James's professional situation evolved. The properties, investments, and liquid assets transferred to my sole ownership would support my future comfort indefinitely, independent of my professional advancement. Yet financial security felt like an inadequate consolation prize for the collapse of trust and partnership I had believed fundamental to my life for 12 years. Material compensation could not replace the shattered foundation of shared values and mutual respect I had thought our marriage was built upon. "Have you heard anything about the board's decision regarding the interim COO position?" Linda asked, shifting topics as we gathered the settlement documentation. "Not yet," I replied, checking my phone reflexively. The FBI investigation has understandably dominated their attention these past few days. As if summoned by our discussion, my phone rang. Robert Davidson's direct line appearing on the display. "Katherine," he began without preamble when I answered. "The board has completed deliberations regarding the interim COO appointment. They've reached a unanimous decision in your favor, effective immediately." The professional validation registered distantly through the emotional complexity of the day's events. "Thank you, Robert. I appreciate the board's confidence. There's more," he continued, his tone suggesting significant developments. "The Ethics Committee has completed its review of the cardiology department situation. Given the FBI investigation and James's administrative leave status, they're recommending restructuring the entire department leadership. We'd like you to oversee that transition as your first major initiative as interim COO. The cosmic irony was almost too perfect. My first significant action in my new leadership role would involve dismantling and rebuilding the department my husband had led, addressing the systemic vulnerabilities his leadership had created or exploited. I'll need to establish appropriate separation protocols given my personal connection, I noted, administrative instincts automatically engaging despite the day's emotional turbulence. Already incorporated into the transition plan, Davidson assured me. The board specifically values your intimate understanding of the department's vulnerabilities while appreciating the need for procedural safeguards against perceived conflicts. After ending the call, I shared the development with Linda, who nodded approvingly. Perfect professional progression parallel to the divorce resolution. The narrative becomes one of institutional recognition of your capabilities rather than personal displacement. She wasn't wrong about the optics, but the reality felt more complex than any external narrative could capture. Within weeks, I had lost a husband, gained significant financial assets, advanced professionally, and watched a man I had once deeply respected face potential criminal charges that might permanently end his distinguished medical career. The consequences were still unfolding, ripples expanding outward from that dramatic restaurant confrontation that had shattered the carefully constructed facade of my marriage. Each revelation had triggered new developments, each decision reshaping the landscape of possibilities ahead. As I left Linda's office with the settlement agreement secured, my phone chimed with an incoming text from an unexpected source, Vanessa Collins. Heard about settlement and FBI investigation. Need to talk about baby's future. James isn't thinking clearly. Coffee tomorrow? Another ripple, another consequence unfolding from choices made months and years before. The child that would arrive, in less than 2 months, represented both the most painful aspect of James's betrayal and the most innocent party in our complicated situation. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., Portland Coffee House on 3rd, I replied after brief consideration, because while the settlement had resolved the financial aspects of my relationship with James, the human consequences would continue evolving long after the legal documents were filed and forgotten. The child Vanessa carried would connect us all in complicated ways for decades to come, an ongoing reminder of choices, consequences, and the complex aftermath of betrayal. As I drove home through rain-slicked Portland streets, I reflected on the day's developments. The settlement conference, the COO appointment, the planned restructuring of James's department, the impending conversation with Vanessa, all pieces of a new reality I was still learning to navigate. For 12 years, my identity had been partially defined by my relationship with James. Brilliant physician's wife, supportive partner, hospital administrator married to department chief. Now that framework had been dismantled, leaving me to construct something entirely new from the wreckage of what we had built together. The consequences were still unfolding, but for the first time since Vanessa had appeared at our anniversary dinner, I felt a strange sense of possibility emerging alongside the pain and disillusionment, a future defined by my own choices rather than James's deceptions. Portland Coffee. House offered neutral territory for my meeting with Vanessa, public enough for comfort yet quiet enough for sensitive conversation. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a corner table that afforded both privacy and a clear view of the entrance. The morning crowd had thinned, leaving the cafe relatively peaceful aside from the gentle hiss of the espresso machine and muted conversations among scattered patrons. When Vanessa entered, her pregnancy had visibly advanced in the weeks since our last encounter. Her maternity dress strained against her now prominent belly, her movements deliberate and careful as she navigated between tables. Without the carefully constructed veneer of confidence she had displayed at our previous meetings, she appeared younger and remarkably vulnerable. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, lowering herself awkwardly into the chair across from mine. "I wasn't sure you would." "You mentioned the baby's future," I replied, keeping my tone neutral but not cold. That seemed important enough to warrant a conversation. Vanessa nodded, hands instinctively cradling her stomach in a protective gesture. I had once imagined performing myself during the years of fertility treatments. James isn't thinking clearly about what happens after the baby arrives. With the FBI investigation and his career imploding, he's spiraling. Last night he was talking about potentially fleeing to Canada before charges are filed. The revelation wasn't entirely surprising given James's deteriorating situation, but the potential impact on his unborn child added a troubling dimension. Has he consulted an attorney about the investigation specifically? He's been meeting with some high-profile criminal defense lawyer, but I'm not included in those conversations anymore. Vanessa's voice carried a bitter edge. James has been distancing himself from me since the FBI showed up at Memorial. I think he's realized I'm a liability now, not an asset. The familiar pattern stung despite my emotional distance from James. His tendency to compartmentalize relationships based on their utility to his current circumstances. Vanessa was experiencing the same disillusionment I had confronted weeks earlier, albeit under different circumstances. What specifically concerns you about the baby's future? I asked, focusing on the purpose of our meeting rather than shared grievances about James's character. Everything, she admitted, vulnerability cracking through her composure. The practical realities. If James faces criminal charges, there won't be income or health insurance. My position at Memorial is precarious at best given the ethics violations. I have medical bills, no family support in Portland, and a baby arriving in less than 2 months. The coffee I had ordered for both of us arrived, creating a momentary pause in our conversation. Vanessa absently stirred her decaf latte, gaze fixed on the swirling liquid rather than meeting my eyes. James mentioned you showed remarkable compassion regarding the baby during your settlement discussions, she continued quietly. He said you acknowledged the child's innocence in all this. I had indeed said those words, motivated by principles that transcended my personal grievances with James. The unborn child had no agency in the circumstances of its creation or the complicated adult dynamics surrounding its impending arrival. The child deserves support and stability regardless of its parents' choices, I affirmed, maintaining my professional tone, despite the emotional complexity of discussing my husband's child with his pregnant girlfriend. Vanessa finally looked up, meeting my gaze directly. I know this is an impossible position I've put you in. Asking for help from the woman whose marriage I helped destroy is beyond inappropriate. You didn't destroy my marriage alone, I corrected her mildly. James made his choices long before you entered the picture. The financial deception, the vasectomy while continuing fertility treatments with me, those betrayals predated your relationship. She nodded slowly, accepting this partial absolution with evident relief. Still, I should never have come to that restaurant. That public humiliation was cruel and unnecessary. Why did you? I asked, genuinely curious about the motivation behind that dramatic confrontation. Because I believed we were both being deceived, she explained, hands still protectively cradling her belly. James told me you knew about us, that you had an arrangement allowing him to pursue other relationships. Then I overheard him planning your anniversary dinner, using the same romantic language he used with me. I realized he was living a complete double life. The parallel deceptions created an unexpected common ground between us, both manipulated by the same man. Both discovering our relationships were built on elaborately constructed falsehoods. What are you hoping for from this conversation? I asked directly, steering us back to practical matters. Vanessa took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Advice, primarily. You've known James longer than anyone. You understand how he operates, his patterns. If he does face criminal charges or flees to avoid them, what happens to his child support obligations? What legal protections should I be establishing now? It was a surprisingly practical question, revealing a strategic mindset I hadn't fully appreciated during our previous encounters. Vanessa wasn't seeking financial assistance from me directly, but rather leveraging my experience with James to protect herself and her child. "You need your own attorney immediately," I advised without hesitation. "Separate from whatever agreement you have with James. Someone focused exclusively on establishing paternity, child support obligations, and custody parameters that would survive potential criminal proceedings." She nodded, making notes on her phone. "Any specific recommendations?" I considered the question carefully. Marianne Jeffries specializes in complex paternity and support cases, particularly those involving high-income professionals with complicated asset structures. She's formidable but fair. Vanessa wrote down the name, then hesitated before asking her next question. "The apartment situation. James is talking about giving up the lease since he can't afford it without his clinical income. I'll need somewhere stable before the baby arrives." This request approached the boundary of what I could reasonably provide, yet practical compassion overrode whatever lingering resentment might have influenced my response. "The Rogers Square complex in Southeast Portland has a maternal assistance program," I informed her. "Reduced rent for single mothers, on-site childcare facilities, and proximity to public transportation. The waiting list is typically lengthy, but I serve on the Community Outreach Board and could arrange an expedited application review." Relief flooded Vanessa's expression. "That would be... I don't even know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," I cautioned. "And understand that my assistance comes with boundaries. I can provide connections and practical guidance, but I won't be personally involved with the child or your ongoing situation with James." She nodded quickly. "Of course. I wouldn't expect anything more. Just this conversation is already beyond reasonable expectation." As our meeting continued, we established clear parameters for limited ongoing communication. Strictly practical matters regarding James's legal situation that might impact the child's well-being. No emotional entanglements, no friendship, just pragmatic coordination when necessary for the innocent party caught in our complicated situation. When we finally parted ways, Vanessa paused before leaving the table. "For what it's worth, Katherine, I am truly sorry for the pain this situation has caused you. You've responded with more grace than anyone could reasonably expect." The apology seemed genuine, offered without expectation of forgiveness or absolution. I acknowledged it with a simple nod, neither accepting nor rejecting the sentiment. Walking back to my car afterward, I reflected on the strange new reality taking shape around me. In less than 6 weeks, I had transitioned from betrayed wife to soon-to-be ex-wife to interim COO to unexpected advisor to my husband's pregnant girlfriend. Each role shift had altered my perspective, creating a complex mosaic of professional advancement amid personal upheaval. My phone chimed with a calendar notification. Memorial Board Executive Session. Cardiology Department Restructuring, 2 p.m. The professional dimensions continued advancing in parallel with the personal developments, creating a new equilibrium that bore little resemblance to my life just months earlier. As interim COO, my first major initiative would involve completely reorganizing the department James had built over 12 years, implementing new oversight protocols, financial controls, and leadership structure. The board had given me near-complete autonomy in redesigning the systems his deception had exploited, a professional validation that partially balanced the personal betrayal I had endured. The divorce would be finalized in 3 more weeks. The settlement agreement awaited only judicial approval, which Linda assured me was essentially guaranteed given the mutually accepted terms. James's criminal exposure remained uncertain, dependent on the FBI investigation's findings and potential prosecutorial discretion. And somewhere within this tangled web of consequences, a child would be born, innocent of its parents' choices, yet inevitably shaped by the complicated circumstances of its arrival. The new equilibrium taking shape wasn't what I had envisioned for my life, but it carried unexpected opportunities alongside the painful disillusionment. professional advancement I might not have pursued while supporting James's career, financial independence secured through the settlement agreement, freedom to redefine my identity separate from the roles I had occupied during 12 years of marriage. As I drove toward Memorial Hospital for the afternoon's executive session, I realized the new equilibrium wasn't entirely unwelcome, despite the painful path that had led here. The betrayal had shattered illusions I hadn't known I harbored, about my marriage, about James, about the life we had constructed together. In their place, something more authentic was emerging, a life built on clearer vision and hard-won wisdom, rather than carefully maintained deceptions and compromised principles. The pain remained, but alongside it grew something unexpected, a sense of possibility unbound by the limitati. 6 months later, I stood in my office overlooking Portland's skyline, the city lights glimmering as dusk settled. My divorce was finalized. James awaited trial on federal charges, and Vanessa had delivered a healthy baby girl. As permanent COO, I'd restructured the cardiology department into a model of transparency and excellence. The betrayal that once defined my days had faded into perspective, painful but no longer defining. Sometimes trauma clears away illusions, forcing growth in unexpected directions. When his mistress arrived at our anniversary dinner with her pregnant belly leading the way, she thought she was ending my life. Instead, she had inadvertently set me free. Bonds I had accepted throughout my marriage.